Hello, everybody. HHVM, the new PHP with a question mark. Basically, I'm going to tell you the story of HHVM as I view it and try to get a discussion going about how that might affect our future or not and what impact it might have. Basically, it's purely speculation based on some technical facts that are already known. So you can't sue me for anything I say today. My name is Stefan Priebsch. I'm from Munich, one of the co-founders of the PHP consulting company. We help teams develop software successfully, the keyword being successfully in that context. And now I'm going to talk about Facebook. Everybody knows Facebook, obviously. Second largest website in the world with regards to traffic. I think Google is #1, at least that's according to Alexa, and I checked those figures yesterday. They claim to have 1.2 billion active users each month. To put that in perspective, I took those 1.2 billion, evenly distributed them over the day, and got something like they need to deal with 9,000 logins per second. So that's what 1.2 billion users translates to roughly. I don't have any exact numbers, but I think it's safe to assume that Facebook is big. And if you're really, really big, you suddenly have a few problems that people less big don't have. So Facebook claims to have 180 petabytes of data per year. That was in 2012. Honestly, anything beyond a terabyte is sort of beyond my comprehensions. I don't even know how many zeros a petabyte has. It's a lot. And must translate to a lot of disks. And they don't really say how much code they have, but published numbers that you can find on the internet that are unconfirmed are ranging somewhere between 10 and 30 million lines of PHP code. They also have some code written in other languages, but obviously this is IPC, so we're going to focus on the PHP code for today. And I would say that's a lot. Now, what kind of problems would this kind of company have? Probably performance. So, rumors are that Facebook, among other things, re-implemented TCP/IP because they figured their internal networks are really safe and reliable. So we don't need all this error handling and checksum stuff. So we have, the rumors are that they built a very, very thin TCP/IP stack on their own. Those are things that average developers don't really have to do. Those are problems that you don't really have to solve. And as a matter of fact, performance was not even the prime motivator for the whole HHVM thing that we're going to talk about now. Turns out that performance was not really the issue. The issue was resource usage. Now, as Facebook grew, they started about 10 years ago, and they have rewritten their code base a couple of times, as far as we know. And they always choose an approach that allowed for some growth, and at some point they realized that they had to invent the wheel again and start over because they had grown so big that they were facing new challenges. And one of the things that they realized at some point was, if you're executing PHP code, that's kind of slow. Kind of slow, with a quotation mark, means it's not really slow for the average PHP user, but if you have optimized everything else, then at some point you realize, oh, PHP is an interpreted language. And interpreted languages are slow by design. That's a trade-off, right? We're throwing source code somewhere, it gets interpreted without an explicit compilation step, and that takes some time. If you compile a program, you have a compilation time, and you don't really care about how long that is because it's separate from execution of the code. So PHP by design is a rather slow language. I'm saying rather slow because it's not really slow. It's fast enough. Because most of the time, let's face it, PHP, like all other programming languages, waits for I/O, waits for the database, waits for other systems to answer to HTTP requests, maybe. Somebody aptly said, all languages wait at the same speed. All languages don't scale, because I/O is always the issue. So with Facebook, resource usage, as they executed PHP code, was an issue for them. And they figured if we could execute PHP code using less resources, we actually might save on a couple of servers, because Facebook runs, well, no published figures, anything between 50,000 and millions of servers, probably a solid 6-digit number. If you can save like 10% of resources, that translates to an outrageously big number of servers that you don't need. There is money. There is money you can save. There is operational cost you can save. Well, if you are Facebook. If you are a bit smaller than Facebook, like the average company running 20 or 50 servers or 500, I don't know, there's a lot less potential to save. Well, 10% would translate to maybe 5 servers. That's some money, but that's still not justifying the investment of having a few people reinvent PHP, so to say. And this, in essence, is exactly what Facebook did. They could have chosen to rewrite the code base, in theory. In practice, well, how long does it take to rewrite 10 million lines of code or 30 million lines of code? Takes more than a couple of weeks. And well, it's expensive, it's risky. You don't really know what the code currently is doing. Rewriting everything is a hard thing. And you can't really make a soft transition from the existing code base to the new one. That's probably a tough problem to solve. So rewriting obviously was not an option for Facebook from an economic point of view. I think they are still sort of happy with PHP, and they've always been. But at some point they figured, well, we could choose a faster way, a way that uses less resources primarily to actually run our scripts, but rewriting them manually in another language is not an option. But why would you need to rewrite code manually? What do computer scientists do? I mean, they have crazy ideas and say, hey, you know what? We could write software that rewrites our software in another language. How about converting PHP to C++? And C++ we can compile. Then we have all the advantages of compiled code, which we can optimize. Takes a long time to compile and optimize, but we don't care. We deploy it, and it's a lot faster and loses less resources. It's an interesting question, by the way, if it's really a lot faster or if it takes quite some effort to make it faster. In essence, this is what Facebook did, I think, in 2010, when they released Hip-Hop for PHP. Rumors are they had several teams working on approaches how to make the world better for Facebook, the technical world, I mean. And one of the solutions was Hip-Hop. That's a cross-compiler transforming PHP to C++. And that's very interesting because it solved quite a few problems. They were using a lot fewer resources, so they could save on a lot of servers. But then it raised a couple of issues, because suddenly you lose the advantages of interpreted code. You can't just deploy one source code file. You have to deploy a monolithic binary of your application. In the case of Facebook, that was about 1 gigabyte in size, and they had to set up a BitTorrent infrastructure internally to distribute the code. So it's fair to say that that raised quite a few new additional problems. And one of the problems they were facing, the developers were facing, was, well, we can't do that F5 thing. You know? I mean, everybody's talking about test automation, whether you have that or not. A lot of developers like that quick feedback, press F5 and see if my code works. And with a compiled language, you can't really do that. So that's a disadvantage. It didn't make the developers happy. As an answer to that, Facebook actually wrote hip-hop in an interpreted version as a separate piece of software. And that worked in theory. In practice, they realized that it was too hard for them to keep them both in sync. So basically, the interpreted version was behaving differently than the compiled version, and that's a bad position to be in. So in the long run, they figured that hip-hop would not be the right solution. Even if they had already demonstrated that they could save on a lot of system resources executing PHP code in the first place and still keep writing PHP code but executing something different. According to my observations, my personal observations, it went rather silent for a couple of years then. And then suddenly, I was in Silicon Valley last year in October with Sebastian Bergman, visiting ZendCon, and we got pinged by Facebook saying, hey guys, would you like to stop over for a visit in our office? And that was when they showed us that thing, HHVM, and what they did. That was really cool. Back at the time was still under NDA, so we were not allowed to talk about that because they had their public release not yet planned. And what they did is, well, that compiling everything up front thing didn't work out too well. So how about combining that scripting approach with a compilation approach? That's what you call a just-in-time compiler. So basically you have an interpreted language, just like PHP, that internally has a compiler, but PHP internally will compile the full script. And the just-in-time compiler, sort of as it executes, compiles bits and pieces of the code down to assembly language, to machine code to be correct. That can be executed rather quickly and doesn't need a Zend engine to run on. So this is basically what HHVM is. It's a different PHP runtime. You can throw PHP code at it. It's going to execute the PHP code internally. It's a completely different piece of software. There is no Zend engine. It's not PHP as we know it. It's another piece of software. Uses different representations of the code and compiles down to machine code versus the Zend engine, which interprets bytecode. So at the end of the day, every microprocessor always interprets code, right? Machine code is an interpreted language, so processors work like that. Bytecode is the machine language of a virtual machine, so you have that whole thing in software. That's how the Zend engine works. This is how Java VM works, by the way, traditionally at least. So you have interpretation directly by the microprocessor versus the overhead of running a Zend engine. Now, the quotes are to stress that this is overhead that the average developer and the average user of PHP is not concerned about. It doesn't hurt us. PHP is fast enough because I/O is still where the action is. Again, if you have a large scale, well, if you can significantly save on resources, that would be a good thing. So now we suddenly have all the advantages of a scripting language back because we can deploy a single source code file. We don't have to deploy the code base. Actually, Facebook has an internal representation of PHP code that the PHP code gets translated to, and they don't actually have to deploy the source code, but they are deploying a SQLite database which contains an intermediary representation that then gets compiled down to machine language. So it's basically, from a technical point of view, if you forgive me the term, it's really crazy shit that they've been doing. And what they've been doing is, well, it's an economic trade-off. It's cheaper to change the platform. It's cheaper to change the engine than to have thousands of developers that you need to retrain using a new language or even have them rewrite the whole thing. And whether they had rewritten the whole thing in a different language, wouldn't have been much of a help. So the problem they set out to solve was cut down on resource usage. And the interesting thing is that where they are at now has some consequences that actually led them to go even further steps. We'll discuss those in a bit. So first of all, we have that performance thing. We have that resource usage thing. So it turns out that when you compile code, you can add optimizations. The funny thing is that dynamically typed languages as PHP really perform rather bad if you compile them, because you have to compile them to very generic code that has to make a distinction between, is that an integer, is that a string, is that whatnot, is that a float? So that's a lot of code, and that's a lot of complexity involved that basically causes dynamically typed code, if you compile it, to not perform rather well. Well, PHP is dynamically typed, as we know, so there is sort of a conceptual gap between the two things. As a matter of fact, the speed gains from compiling result from a stronger typing. So with hip-hop, what they did was, first of all, they ran a process to analyze PHP code. And sometimes it's really clear that some variable is an integer. And then they had a type inference. Hey, if this is an integer, then passing it there, this must be an integer. So you can basically build a tree or a graph of all the types. And you know what variable has what type for some of the variables, not all of them. And for those where it works, you can compile it down to code that exactly works for that variable type. Because, well, microprocessors, they are strongly typed. You can work with a character or a float or an integer. You have to make a distinction. At the PHP level, you don't. So this leads to the conclusion that writing code that's more strictly typed might actually be a good idea. And a lot of people have been arguing about that in the PHP world. If you ask Java developers, they say, oh, without a strict typing, well, you can't really write decent software. You can't write software at scale. You can't manage code bases with a couple of million lines of code. Well, what's the biggest code base in PHP we have? Anybody above 100,000 lines, roughly? Okay, above 500,000? Okay, anybody above 1 million? Okay, so that's, according to my experience, I very, very rarely see code bases above 1 million lines in PHP. I've been listening to a Java consultant who said, I don't start thinking below 10 million. So, one of the chances that HHVM brings better performance, less resource usage. That sort of sounds lame because Microsoft, since Windows 3.0, with each version they have told us, oh, better performance. And it's just better performance because you had to buy a bigger computer. But, well, they got away with it, at least until now. And I think now they are considering giving their operating systems away almost for free. Maybe that's a lesson. But anyway, I think for many users of existing software, like Magento, like Oxid eSales, like big e-commerce systems, like big pieces of monolithic software that you can just use, they are very interested in performance gains. Look at all those caching mechanisms, look at all those varnish that they are using. So if you're one of those companies, it might be actually very interesting to look at HHVM and see whether you can get performance gain out of the whole thing. I would never dare to say, okay, use HHVM, it's going to be faster. I've actually seen people benchmark HHVM to be slower than PHP. Keep in mind that it's a just-in-time compilation, so at first execution, it needs to compile down. It's actually slower than stock PHP. On subsequent executions, it's usually a lot faster. So you need to do some kind of cache warming thing for your code so that you can really get up to speed. But let's assume that you're a hosting company or a cloud-based hosting company and you can offer 20% performance benefit over other solutions, or you can do the same with 20% fewer resources. I think from an economic point of view, that might be very, very interesting. So let's talk about more chances and risks. Hack is sort of the next logical step. Once Facebook had realized that cross-compiling PHP code does have value, they also realized that dynamically typed code is hard to cross-compile. So why not type the code more statically? That's also a good idea if you can add that on top of an existing code base, because it prevents developers from making mistakes. That's one of the fundamental differences of a language like PHP, where people say, oh, PHP is great because it's so easy to get started with. But then PHP is sort of sucky because it's so easy to get started with, and you get a lot of developers that don't really know what they're doing. Versus a strongly typed language like Java, I remember how long it took me to write my first Java program and get that to compile when I was back at university, which is almost 10 years ago. That's really scary. So it's a lot more difficult in the beginning, and this is what makes PHP so appealing to many. But on the long run, it turns out that this dynamic typing is not the best of ideas, because you're passing around parameters without really knowing what they are. Where people argue that on the web, strong typing doesn't really make sense, because in essence, we're always processing strings. It's always HTTP requests, and those are strings. And we always send strings back as an HTTP response. So why should we have strong typing? Why should I need to convert everything from string to something else? This is why dynamic typing as PHP does it makes sense from that perspective. From the maintenance aspect, I've been talking to companies that actually have multiple millions lines of code, PHP code base, and they say, you know, it's a very complex task for us that we actually have to execute PHP code versus have the compiler tell us that we have done stupid things. So you can get away, or you can work around the lack of static analysis that would be present in a compiled language by running more unit tests. It's as simple as that. If you want to make sure that something is a certain parameter type, well, just write a unit test, pass a sensible value, pass a nonsense value, and you know what results to expect. So it's actually, in theory at least, pretty easy to work around the type system issues, if they're not real issues. Well, Facebook has realized that and said, okay, how about we add more typing to PHP? And they went an approach they call gradual typing. It's sort of, we are loosely typed and we are moving towards being strictly typed, but we make that optional. It's sort of like the optional type hints in PHP. And this is what they call hack. I think the name is questionable, but that's my personal taste. They also changed the address of Facebook headquarters to One Hack Away. Well, so what we see here is it looks almost like PHP, and it's in essence, it's backwards compatible to PHP, but you can add type hints on top. I'll not go deeper into the details of hack. I think Sebastian has a talk coming up where he's going to do that. For Facebook, they say that internally they have converted almost all of their code base to hack. And they have found loads of issues without actually executing the code. PHP is not exactly known to be a language that makes it easy to perform static code analysis. With hack and with the type inference options that you have, you're a lot better off. And actually, one of the things that I enjoyed most about HHVM when they showed it to us, HHVM is based on a solid, defined abstract syntax tree, which would be the perfect data structure to run code analysis on. So I was really hooked by that, because in PHP you have the token stream, and this is really ugly. And then everything is well, very vague, let's say. So that might have been an interesting option, using HHVM to actually perform static code analysis of PHP code. One of the downsides is Facebook removed that feature somewhere on the way, and it's rather unclear what the state of affairs is. This is part of the next talk, and yeah. So actually, I think that Hack as the new PHP is a chance, because Hack does offer some very, very interesting features, like more typing, like collections, like stuff that you don't even understand if you first look at it. There's a lot of interesting things, and getting them into PHP would take years, which also may be due to the fact that PHP core developers sometimes have a hard time agreeing on things. We're talking about the chances first, and we're going to cover the risks, don't worry. So, the PHP thing, that's, I think, to me, that's the killer feature. With HHVM, you can write PHP extensions in PHP. So with PHP, you can easily extend the core of the language, but you have to write C code to do that. With HHVM, you can actually write extensions in PHP. There's a native, there's a library that allows you to perform native calls. And if you look at the HHVM, which is open source, it's available on GitHub, they have the file info extension, for example, and I think a few others are written in PHP, so you can actually read the PHP code of a PHP extension. That's very, very interesting, because if you think about all those frameworks, what do frameworks do? Frameworks add layers of abstraction to make things easier for developers. With the best intent, sometimes they even fail doing that, but they have a good intent, though. What is a layer of abstraction? Abstraction means it'll get slower, because the more abstraction there is, the more complexity, the more stuff you need to do at runtime. Now, in a compiled language, we might actually have the abstraction in the source code, which makes it more readable and more maintainable to us. But we can optimize out those abstractions before we execute the code. There are some approaches doing that in PHP as well, and have always been. Zend had the PHP optimizer. I think they have discontinued it now. I think that optimizing bytecode or PHP code or whatever code while you compile it is a very, very appealing concept. With a traditional interpreted language, you can't really do that, because you don't know how much time you're going to spend optimizing it. And if you do that in the execution step, you'll probably not end up with a runtime benefit. If you decouple the compilation step and compile up front, optimizing becomes very appealing. And well, with the HHVM and the hip-hop approach, I think optimizing might be easier to do, because you have a lower level language, which is easier to understand from a technical point of view, not from a human point of view. So it's probably easier to optimize. And I think this might be a killer feature, because a framework suddenly might be viewed as a kind of extension to PHP, as a kind of library. Some framework developers say, you know, we as frameworks, we provide abstraction from the actual language. So if the language changes and evolves, you don't need to modify your applications. And there are a lot of possibilities in that. Then, of course, well, I already mentioned that, the performance aspect, compiler optimizations. So I got the slides in the wrong order. I think we are going to see a lot more of that in HHVM. And yeah, we'll get to that. So let's talk about happy people. Let's talk about open source projects. And let's also talk about risks. The risks that I see that HHVM might come attached with. It's not a real open source project. Yes, it is on GitHub. You can fork it. You can send pull requests, and they'll probably merge it. But it's not a true open source project because it's controlled by Facebook. The people working at Facebook are paid to do this, and they're allowed to open source it, and I fully believe them that they do in the best intent, and to all the people I've talked with, I'm absolutely convinced that they really live the open source principle. But still, it's a commercial company. They make decisions based on economic whatever parameters, and they might in the future just decide to not continue it as an open source project. Question there?
Which license?
Honestly, beats me. You have to look that up at GitHub. I would assume that it's BSD type, but I wouldn't know. That's an outrageously great question, because I've been researching around that for half a year, and I've never had the idea of looking at the license. So the thing is that they do what Facebook needs. And the abstract syntax tree thing got into their way, so they removed it, and I leave the rant part on that up to Sebastian. Okay?
It's dual license under both the PHP and the Zend license, which is tricky. Both the PHP license and the Zend license are variations of the BSD312 license. Parts of hack, especially the hack checker, are licensed under the normal BSD license. There's an additional grant of patent rights, except where otherwise noted, whatever that means. And just one more sentence. Stefan mentioned it. Yes, you can send pull requests, but before a pull request even gets a chance of being accepted, you have to sign the CLA.
So no chance of forking?
Of course you can fork it.
I mean, because of the patents stuff.
I'm not a lawyer.
Okay.
So
What about Zen? Zen is also a commercial company. What do they want?
we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. Maybe. I'm not sure I can answer this question. So that's probably not, if that's not on camera, that was too much to repeat it. So license question is answered. It's a BSD derivative, and we really have no clue what that legally, what the legal implications of those might be. That's one of the hard things of those licenses. If you started reading them, I was actually looking at the Facebook CLA and said, no, I'm not going to sign that. So I can't contribute to HHVM. It's a sort of a philosophical problem that I have with that. Facebook could lose interest. They could lose interest in running that as open source, in publishing that as open source. Currently, they're trying to build up a community. They're trying to get other companies interested in using it because they can benefit if that's an open source project, and maintenance is something that they don't have to do on their own. Plus, if more people out there use it and also maybe use that as a transition path to hack, then they would be more up to working for Facebook because they already know the language. So for Facebook, it's currently a really, really good idea to run that as an open source project. But one of the things that actually might happen, and personally, I think that that's something that we might see happen in the next 2 or 3 years, is that Facebook loses interest in supporting PHP. Now, they are currently aiming for PHP compatibility. They are actually aiming for 100% compatibility. I don't think this is technically possible, but they claim to be close by running the test suites of 50 or so commonly known open source projects. And they're very, very close to 100% of tests that pass. So that's a promising sign. If they have converted everything to hack internally, as they move away from PHP, there's going to be a split. They say, okay, if PHP introduces new features, we're going to adapt hack to PHP. Well, it's actually pretty simple to do. You can always write a cross-compiler, right? They've done that before. They got that down. But whether it's still economically feasible or interesting for them to still support PHP on HHVM in 2 or 3 years, I don't know. Maybe other projects have converted to Hack and nobody's using PHP by then, I don't know. We'll discuss that in a bit. This is exactly what could happen. A split, a fragmentation of the community. And this could happen in multiple ways. Number one, maybe Hack becomes the professional enterprise PHP. Maybe PHP becomes the, well, that's sort of for the smaller project things. That could happen. Maybe that's not even that much of a problem. Maybe we already had that. If you look at PHP 4, PHP 5, wasn't that pretty much the same thing? PHP 5 was available. Everybody said, well, that's enterprisey, that's enterprise ready, and it was marketing at the time. We know that. It was not enterprise ready, but it sort of got pushed into the enterprises, and then, well, nowadays I think you can really, really build decent enterprise applications based on PHP in current versions. But still PHP 4 was around, and a lot of projects were stuck with PHP 4, so there already was a fragmentation. Don't we always have that fragmentation if we introduce a new version? Well, PHP is often picked upon for having all those old issues, those old design flaws. And yeah, guys, you don't remove them. You know why they don't remove them? They care about backwards compatibility. And this is a big issue. If you care about backwards compatibility, you can't really move forward. If you move forward, you have to leave people behind. So you have a fragmentation, you have a split. I think, in a way, that's a very natural thing to happen. And if there is a new major version of PHP at some point in the future, whether that's called PHP 6 or PHP 7, I don't know, PHP 6, the name is already taken, because they tried that a couple of years ago and the thing failed. But anyway, it's going to be new and better if we are lucky. And maybe it's not so compatible, so we have that split again. We have people jumping on the new version, we have people sticking with the old. You see the same thing happening with Drupal 7 versus Drupal 8. You see the same thing happening with Typo 3 versus the new flow-based version, where a lot of developers say, wow, OOP, domain-driven design, cool, I'll jump on the bandwagon. And others say, oh, that's crap. I want to stay with my scripting type approach. And everybody is right with their decisions for what they need to do. So there's no common solution. And I think actually we have a split and fragmented community. So maybe that's not even a risk. Maybe that's even a chance, because it allows us to move forward. And this basically is exactly what the blue elephant stands for. Whenever cool things appear in the IT world, somebody sort of is going to adapt that into PHP. Now, who's heard about PHPNG? Wow, quite a few. That's PHP next generation, possibly. So Zend has invested, and they had their one PHP core developer that we know of that actually works on the PHP core, who is fully paid by Zend. And they had him work on some just-in-time compilation ideas and some other ideas, and trying just-in-time compilation out, they realized, oh, there's some things in the Zend engine that we need to change. So he came up with a bunch of changes saying, okay, this is PHP in a different version. I've sort of improved it, and it performs a lot better. Isn't that awesome? This is what Facebook has done for us, in the least. The PHP project was urged to move forward. Actually, that also happened when they released hip-hop. Because following the release of hip-hop, we had performance increase in PHP 5.4, 5.5, and it was substantial. They did that as an answer to Facebook releasing hip-hop. And now we potentially get PHP next generation, whatever that may be, wherever that ends up, however that's going to work out. That's something that the PHP core developers need to get clear about and figure out which way to go and what to do. But at the end of the day, in 1, 2, or 3 years, we will have a platform that's substantially faster, probably takes fewer resources to execute. That's the cool thing. It's not really that important whether it's HHVM or whether it's PHP that your code runs on. The most important thing is that the platform improves. And by having a new kid on the block, it's like, oh, we need to do something, otherwise people start losing interest, and everybody's shifting over there, because that's where all the action is. So I don't really know what is going to happen, and I couldn't tell. But I don't think it's that important, because if you look at it from a code perspective, you will always have to adapt your code to new platforms or to changing platforms, whether that's PHP 4 to PHP 5 or Symfony to Symfony 2.1, Symfony 2 to Symfony 2.1, where you also had to make changes, whether that is whatever, PHP 5 to PHP Next, or maybe PHP 5 to HHVM. There's going to be a transition. The cool thing is that most of the big projects, since the tests were run on HHVM, have also already started adapting their software to HHVM. Well, technically, it's not a big difference. If you do, you always find that odd switch saying, okay, in PHP 5.3, we'll do it that way. From PHP 5.4, we'll do it that way. It's pretty much the same. It's okay, if it's HHVM, then we'll do it that way. So it's just another version switch. Maybe in 1 or 2 years, we don't even know what is running below. It's just PHP code that we execute. And if it performs, if it doesn't crash, probably everybody is really, really happy. So that's for my part. I think we have a couple of minutes for questions, and would be eager to hear about what your thoughts, concerns, or ideas are. If you're involved, I would be interested in, for example, I would be interested in finding out who's actively trying out HHVM and for what purposes. Everybody except Sebastian is allowed to answer. Because with him I know. Yep. I've seen some shows of hands who's trying out HHVM. Can I get some feedback? What are you guys looking at? What are you guys trying out?
Just trying to adapt for the future.
Mm-hmm.
Because currently, for example, my application doesn't actually changes a lot. I can run the same code without any ifs, and as far as that goes, everything's fine. Why not to just anticipate what will happen in the future and be ready for it? So that's it. There is also speed improvements, pretty noticeable, but who knows? As PHP increases, like this performance, maybe it will be equal. I don't know.
So for my part, I've seen my code crash a lot on HHVM because some features were missing, but that was a while back, and they have put in a lot of effort and improved. I think there's still some extensions that are not working properly, like the XML stuff, and I know a lot of applications rely on that, so they don't work. But on the other hand, people claim that, for example, as complex software like Magento runs on HHVM. Has anybody any experience with that? Yeah.
Well, I made some small tests. Yeah.
Okay.
I may say that I'm in the middle of this. Yeah? So I have not much to say. I just started to installing the hip hop, and well, looking forward. I also read some articles in the internet of people that managed to do this, and there's some measurements about the performance, and well, it's worth to try, I think.
Mm-hmm. So, but it works in the first place.
Well, we will see.
Okay.
But according to people, yes, it is working, so that's why I'm starting with it.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, then let's open up for questions.
I have a question about, well, yesterday we had a session about SPL. And I have a question about, well, SPL is such a non-documented thing in PHP today. And what about hack in this situation? I mean, what is going on with those who who use it heavily, and how is it working with that today? And is it going to work?
Very good question. So basically the question is, will SPL work on hack? I'm sure it's there because it's nowadays technically an integral part of PHP, so PHP can't come without SPL. And I'm pretty sure that they are using it and they got it to work. Whether it really works and behaves exactly as PHP in all the edge cases, I personally don't believe that that's technically possible. I've recently seen a bug regarding the Drupal test suite, where the problem was that HHVM would return data with the elements in a different order. It's technically not a bug, but it's a different behavior. Whether that leads to a bug in your software because you're relying on the order of elements that PHP gives you, that's a most interesting question. So I think that technically 100% compatibility is not really possible. But on the other hand, the question is whether that matters. Because if you know that this is an issue and you sort of encapsulate and work around, which a lot of the frameworks do all the time, look at all this weird workaround for that quirky bug, pieces of code and applications and frameworks and PHP Unity can tell a story about that. So it's a common thing to do that. Yeah.
Do you see any parallels with Google and Google Web Toolkit development, what they did with Java, combining it into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript with what Facebook is doing with PHP, or is it completely different, or is it similar in any way?
To be honest with you, I could answer the question if I had more than a faint clue of what Google Web Toolkit actually is and does. I don't really know anything about that, so I don't have the data to compare, sorry.
So is there some kind of rule or project side where it makes sense to think about to use hip-hop?
Very good question. Is there any sort of, you're looking for guidelines when it might make sense to use hip-hop, right? I think I can answer with a general answer. Whenever you ask me a performance question, you have solution A and solution B. And which is better? I will always answer, benchmark it in your situation. Because there are very, very basic things like auto-loading in PHP, where I've seen people confirm that it's slow. And then I've seen people confirm that it's fast. And they are all right. In their situation it works, in their situation it doesn't. So it's always your performance bottleneck in your situation. The same piece of code in a different context might not be a performance bottleneck. So that's the hard thing about performance. You can never say, okay, this is a problem and this is the solution. So what you need to do is just install it. It's available as an FPM or as a FastCGI module. So basically, you can have a web server running PHP and HHVM concurrently. And you can just try it out and see if it works and benchmark it. If it's faster for you and if it uses a lot fewer resources for you, then it might be an option for you. There is no general advice as use that because it's quick. It doesn't work. There was somebody back there, yeah?
Are there any rough numbers on memory savings when using HHVM?
I know that there are savings. I can't give you concrete numbers because they depend on the application. But I'd say ballpark figure 20–30%.
More. So Facebook themselves, they say they save memory on a factor of 8. Oh. So, yeah.
Yeah, if you write the application, you can optimize the platform for your use case. That's what makes it very appealing for Facebook. Whether you will be able to see the same benefits is questionable. I'm not saying it's not possible, but it's very, very much dependent on your situation. Yeah?
Did you or somebody here try it on Windows? Does it run?
Currently not. They're working on a port. That's what I know, which is sort of a funny thing because Microsoft invested a lot of money in making PHP work on Windows as a first-class citizen, and now the PHP world is talking about moving to a different platform, which basically puts Microsoft back on square one. I think that's sort of an issue topic, because Facebook just does not run Windows. So it's not their use case. And even if somebody makes it work on Windows, honestly, I think if Microsoft doesn't jump on the bandwagon and help them do that and maybe fund that, it's probably not going to be a feasible solution, because as Windows evolves and as HHVM or PHP evolves, there's always going to be quirks. We have seen that for many years in the PHP project. But that may be a good incentive of switching from Windows to... Just saying.
Are there other known differences between Hack and PHP than the types?
Where you have a lot of additional features. Basically, they say it's PHP plus other stuff. There's probably some PHP code that doesn't work in Hack. I wouldn't know about the details. And there's a load of new interesting features, which basically is a completely new and improved language based on PHP. It might actually be worth just looking at it to find out what is possible and what you can do. And I think one of the things that is going to happen on the longer run is that a lot of people look at Hack and say, wow, that's a cool feature. And we know that the PHP project has always been good at adopting those features. If there are features out there that people love in other languages, another platform, PHP has adopted that. So if you wait a little, you're going to see those features or part of those features in PHP maybe. If not, well, maybe then that's a reason for you to switch over to use HHVM if you say, oh, those are cool features and I absolutely need them to write my software in a decent way. I think one last question.
Yeah, okay. Considering that now you have a kind of compiled language, is it possible to link libraries from another languages? Let's say I have a chance to create something in C very fast.
Yes.
It's really easy.
And that's say you can write extension in PHP and you have a native interface that allows you to call native functions from PHP. And this is outrageously cool, because in PHP you need to write C code to do that, but now you could do it in PHP
yeah,
code.
But I mean, sometimes you need for performance writing something in C that
you can write your extension in PHP and then use special syntax to call into native libraries. And it's yes.
And honestly, just to give you an idea, if that is something that you need, I would actually consider just deploying HHVM to run one service in your company that allows you to write PHP code to dig into those libraries and benefit from them. And the rest can still be PHP, and you'll have to talk to that service over the wire. So there's a lot of potential, I think. Yeah, I hope so. Okay. Fell asleep. So there we go. These are some resources that you can look. Basically, it's Hack, it's HHVM, and it's the wiki page of PHPNG. And this is how you can reach me. If you have any further questions, drop me a line. Thanks for joining. Enjoy the rest of the day.